All right, everyone, thank you for attending our Higher Education Leadership in Uncertain Times webinar. We're going to be speaking about higher education as a career collectively, and we're joined by Professor Natow, Rebecca Natow, who oversees and works with our higher education doctoral program and higher education master's program. Thank you so much for putting together this presentation for us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today. As Victoria said, my name is Rebecca Natow. I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership and policy here at Hofstra University. I teach classes in higher education leadership and policy studies for our master's program and in the educational policy and leadership EDD program. And the title of my presentation today is Higher Education Leadership in Uncertain Times. I chose this topic because higher education is currently experiencing a lot of uncertainty. Even if what we think of as the normal college experience will be returning this fall in a lot of respects, there's a lot about higher education that has changed. And substantial change was already happening even before the pandemic started. But the pandemic brought with it a lot of additional change and new challenges. So higher education leaders and people who aspire to be higher education leaders will need to think differently and innovatively about how to lead their institutions. So in this webinar, I will discuss some of the challenges facing higher education today and why it will be important for higher education administrators and others who work in colleges and universities to learn about such topics as organizational leadership, how to influence policymakers, innovation in education, and other aspects of leading during times of great change. So first, let's consider the current context in which higher education finds itself. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there's a great deal of uncertainty with the higher education sector right now, particularly with regard to the future of higher education. One area of uncertainty has to do with student enrollments. Between 2011 and 2019, higher education institutions across the United States experienced enrollment declines of over 2 million students. Nathan Graw, a social sciences professor at Carleton College, conducted an analysis of demographic trends and concluded that the United States will experience as much as a 15% decline in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds in the population, or in other words, those that are the traditional college-going age, by the year 2026. Enrollments of international students have also generally been down in recent years. Also, higher education has experienced declines in state funding. This is particularly true of public institutions as a share of their institutional revenues. According to Pew Charitable Trust, state government funding for higher education declined by more than $2 billion between 2007 and 2017. As state funding for higher education became more scarce and the cost of doing business for colleges and universities continued to climb, tuition prices rose. And so it's against this backdrop that recent Gallup surveys have found a decline in public trust for higher education, and that approximately 3/4 of respondents believe that higher education is simply unaffordable. And then, of course, there is the COVID-19 crisis, which has had huge implications for higher education and everything else. In the spring of 2020, the spread of COVID-19 around the world led to a mass transition of higher education classes and other programs online. Students were told to vacate their residence halls on very little notice. Some of them didn't have any contingency plans for where they could live. Campus events, activities, programs, including once-in-a-lifetime events such as graduation, were all canceled or moved entirely online. The pandemic affected students and families from underserved communities particularly hard, which added to the trauma of the moment. Many students living in rural or remote areas and those with low income had difficulty accessing the technology they needed to complete their coursework online. In addition to the immediate need for massive shift in how we did teaching and learning, and in addition to the enormous equity implications of the pandemic, higher education leaders were faced with a number of additional changes for their organizations, some of which will continue to have repercussions for many years to come. So for example, institutions refunded much of students' room and board payments in spring 2020. They also lost revenue from not hosting conferences, summer camps, sporting events, other on-campus events that would generally bring in revenue for most of 2020 and often into 2021. Public institutions have been on the receiving end of steep budget cuts at the state level as states seek to stabilize their own budgets. And a number of institutions have had to pay to defend lawsuits from students seeking tuition and fee refund for the abrupt movement of all programming online in spring 2020. The pandemic also led to enrollment declines across the board for higher education. According to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, spring 2021 undergraduate enrollment decreased by nearly 6% nationwide over the previous year. Community colleges in particular suffered steep enrollment declines this past spring, down by more than 11%, according to the same data source. So in short, the pandemic has introduced a great deal of uncertainty into an already uncertain future for higher education. We may not know the full impacts of the pandemic on higher education for many years. There are a number of higher education researchers who are looking into this topic right now. And because the pandemic is not over yet, higher education remains in a state of uncertainty. The good news is that there have been policy actions that have helped higher education to survive and in some cases even thrive during the pandemic. For example, there have been 3 federal stimulus packages that have contained considerable funding for higher education institutions and students, beginning with the CARES Act that passed in the spring of 2020, followed by the year-end coronavirus stimulus bill at the very end of 2020, and of course the American Rescue Plan, which was enacted during President Biden's first 100 days, which provided $40 billion in higher education emergency relief funding. All told, federal stimulus funding for higher education during the pandemic has totaled approximately $76 billion. But the bad news is that this amount still falls short of the nearly $100 billion that the higher education associations have said would be necessary to fully compensate the sector for its losses due to the pandemic. So in short, higher education leaders were facing significant challenges before the pandemic. Those challenges were exacerbated by the pandemic, and the pandemic brought new challenges and even greater uncertainty to a sector that was already facing an uncertain future. But despite all of the problems and uncertainty that higher education is experiencing right now, and I would argue because of these challenges, it's important for society and government to support higher education. And that is because higher education is very valuable for society. And I say that because the research and evidence on this are very clear. Higher education provides benefits of many kinds, and not just to the students who attend college or attend graduate school, but to broader society as well. So I'll start by looking at the individual benefits of higher education. And this refers to benefits and advantages that accrue to individual students and their families when they attend college or achieve a post-secondary degree. Higher education provides economic and non-economic benefits to students who enroll and graduate. Research has shown that college graduates on average have higher earnings than non-college graduates and are more likely to be employed. Research has also shown that median financial earnings increase with higher levels of education. So the more education you get, the higher your financial earnings are likely to be. Also, people with higher education degrees are more likely to be covered by employer-provided health insurance and retirement plans, are more likely to live healthier lifestyles, experience higher quality working conditions and greater social mobility, and have longer life expectancies than people who did not attend college. People who attain higher levels of education are also more likely to have enhanced cognitive and critical thinking skills than people without higher education. Beyond those well-documented individual benefits, advantages accrue to larger society from higher education as well. For example, people who hold college degrees are more likely to engage in volunteer work and community service. They tend to have greater appreciation for cultural differences and diversity, are generally more supportive of civil liberties, and are more likely to vote in public elections than individuals with less education. Colleges and universities also provide economic benefits for the regions in which they are located. The American Council on Education recently estimated that higher education institutions generate a combined $650 billion annually in revenues and billions more in other economic activities for their regions. A more highly educated populace also tends to contribute more tax revenue to their governments. Although people often regard higher education as a private benefit only, having more college-educated people in your population provides these benefits as well. And some have argued that the collective benefits may even outweigh the individualized ones. I'd like to spend a few moments now focusing specifically on the benefits that come from higher education student affairs professionals. Often people who are seeking advanced degrees in higher education leadership, such as the programs we have here at Hofstra, they often work in student affairs or they aspire to work in student affairs, and everyone working in higher education has at least some contact with students. And the evidence is clear on this as well. The work of student affairs professionals has resulted in positive student and social outcomes. Research has found that college students who have more interactions with student affairs professionals tend to develop stronger leadership skills, more academic motivation, and research has also found that participation in new student orientation programs and also student advising are significantly related to higher student retention rates. Students who serve as leaders on their campuses tend to develop a full array of positive outcomes, including increased educational attainment, increased commitments to civic responsibilities, better conflict resolution and decision-making skills, and they're more likely to hold leadership positions in the future. Research has also found that cross-cultural discussions and experiences, such as programming provided by intercultural centers and multicultural student affairs, strongly related to socially responsible leadership development for college students. So given the great importance of higher education, not just for individual students, but for society as a whole, and given the challenging circumstances in which higher education finds itself in 2021, higher education leaders are faced with a number of important responsibilities. I'm referring to leadership broadly here, whether you're an executive or mid-level administrator at a college or university, whether you're a leader of students or student programming or residence halls, whether you're an activist or a policy director or community leader who works with college or pre-college students, the work of higher education leaders has never been more important. And it will also be important for higher education leaders to learn about how they can serve their institutions, their students, their stakeholders, and their communities during times of great change. This will take a bit of thinking outside the box, so to speak, and it will take a great deal of learning about higher education institutions as organizations and how those organizations can obtain the necessary resources that they need to fulfill their educational missions during a challenging time. It's an enormous responsibility and a very important one. There is a wealth of research literature on higher education leadership, higher education institutions as organizations, equity in higher education policy and policy making, college student development, teaching and learning in higher education, and the evolving context of higher education. In master's and doctoral programs in higher education and policy, leadership and policy, such as the ones we offer here at Hofstra, students learn about these critical issues and are challenged to think about how leaders can transform their institutions to meet the challenges of our current times. This slide shows just a sampling of the many important concepts, theories, and research about higher education that can help leaders in the sector to enhance their leadership practice and service to their students and their communities. Typically, higher education institutions are large bureaucracies, but they're also highly political organizations. And organizational theory tells us that higher education institutions are particularly difficult to manage precisely because of these characteristics. They have multiple missions, they have a variety of different goals, and they have separate organizations and divisions within the overall organization, and each of those organizations and divisions has their own goals and missions. There's a famous study in organizational theory that was conducted by social scientists Cohen, March, and Olson in the 1970s. And that study developed the concept of organized anarchy, which refers to organizations whose purposes and goals are sometimes in conflict and whose method of doing their work is not always clear. And the study was conducted with higher education institutions, which Cohen, March, and Olson identified as typical of this organized anarchy model. So understanding colleges and universities as organizations, understanding what organized anarchy is and how to lead it, reading the research on how these organizations function, how they've evolved over time, which innovations have been effective at improving the work of higher education. Very important for current and aspiring higher education leaders. It's also important to understand the role of college leaders, that is, what they do to manage and lead their institutions on a day-to-day basis. So let's begin with discussing the college presidency, as this is the highest and most prominent level of leadership in higher education institutions. It's also a role that is not very well understood by people outside higher education, and even by some people who work in higher education. So looking at this slide, a college president is responsible for first making those high-level strategic decisions that will be in the best interest of the institution at the current time and also into the future. Very importantly, financial management of the institution is an extremely important responsibility, and it tends to consume a lot of college presidents' time. In fact, recent surveys by the American Council on Education have shown that financial management consumes college presidents' time more than anything else. But enrollment management is incredibly important as well, and that also consumes a lot of college presidents' time. Presidents are also responsible for making staffing decisions to develop strong senior leadership team, and all of those leaders in turn will have a lot of responsibilities depending on what their role is, that they'll need to make important decisions that will help the institution in the present and into the future. College presidents are also responsible for keeping the board of trustees informed about the state of the institution and what high-level decisions are being made. And importantly, it is the board of trustees that the president is accountable to, as the boards, they choose the president for their institution and they decide whether to renew the president's contract. So keeping the board informed is a very important role. Also, fundraising for the institution. This is becoming an increasingly important and time-consuming role for college presidents. And it's one that I think the general public doesn't realize how much time that college presidents spend fundraising for their institution. Continuing with the role of college presidents, these leaders are also responsible for representing the institution to the public and the community, staying informed about higher education policy, staying in touch with policymakers and in the good graces of policymakers. Policy advocacy is increasingly important for college presidents. And of course, communicating with and getting to know all institutional stakeholders is another very important role of college presidents. And there are many, many, many other higher education leadership roles in addition to the college presidency. This slide lists a number of those, but it's important to know that there are many others in addition to these as well. Some people have argued that colleges and universities are often like mini towns or villages in and of themselves. And as such, if there's a need for a particular role in society, you're almost always sure to find someone playing that role in a college or university, particularly the larger ones. That's not to say that you'll find all of these administrative positions at every single institution in the United States, but these departments and positions are found at a lot of colleges and universities. And I think this list will demonstrate the great diversity there is in higher education leadership roles. So there are leaders of academic affairs, such as the provost, who oversee the academics of the institution, including the faculty. There's student affairs leaders, and that includes student programming, residence life, student honor boards, and many other student leadership, many other roles that people play at the institution working with students in the co-curriculum. There are leaders of diversity, equity, and inclusion, admissions, financial aid, and enrollment management, planning and administration, business officers and financial affairs. There's athletics leadership, leadership of facilities and operations, of educational technology and information technology, public relations, alumni affairs and institutional development, and of course, legal affairs and general counsel, and there are many others as well. So if there is an aspect of higher education, or if there's a particular function of society that's that's very interesting to you, that is particularly important to you, the chances are good that there's a leadership role in higher education that's related to your area of interest and in need of good and innovative leaders. Finally, let's consider the future of higher education. Going back to what I said toward the beginning of this webinar, the higher education sector is facing a number of challenges. So what does the future hold for higher education in the United States? Last spring and summer, when higher education was still reeling during the early months of the pandemic, there were many who predicted very tough times for higher education. Some went so far as to predict mass college closures, such as up to 1,000 colleges potentially shutting their doors permanently. But so far, nearly a year and a half into the pandemic, only 6 colleges have closed since March 2020, and 9 others have merged with other institutions. This is according to the publication Higher Ed Dive, which has been tracking college closures and mergers since 2016. And all of those colleges, the ones that have closed or merged since spring 2020, were small private colleges that were experiencing financial difficulties even before the pandemic. In March 2021, the Chronicle of Higher Education asked me to write a perspective piece on why more colleges have not closed. What I wrote was that traditional higher education institutions, by and large, are durable and resilient. For decades, prognosticators have predicted the demise of large segments of higher ed, and those predictions have not come to fruition. Even during the Great Depression, only about 2% of colleges permanently closed. A much more recent analysis found that private higher education institutions with risk factors for failure, the vast majority of them were still operating 4 years later. And again, the widespread college closures predicted by some that were supposed to result from the pandemic have not occurred, at least not yet. Now, that's not to say that the pandemic hasn't been bad for higher ed. The sector has suffered steep enrollment declines, substantially reduced revenues, increased costs, and other financial challenges as a direct result of the pandemic. But to quote my Chronicle article, it hasn't been the asteroid hit that many pundits had predicted. And why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. First, higher education institutions are just that, institutions, meaning they are fixtures in their communities. And they play an important role in numerous people's lives. Many of them, particularly the larger institutions, the ones that have been around a very long time, are major regional employers, and they have legions of alumni and other supporters. The social demand for higher education remains high, even amid the pandemic-induced dip in enrollments. Also, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there's been a federal stimulus package, 3 of them actually, that have provided funding for higher education, and that has helped a great deal, even if it's fallen short of the total amount institutional and student advocates were seeking. But a big part of the story of why higher education continues to survive is because of its willingness to evolve, to adapt to new contexts and market demands, as organizational theory would predict. This means that higher education institutions respond to new environments by developing new in-demand academic and co-curricular programs and eliminating others that have become obsolete. Some institutions have rebranded themselves. Some have merged with other institutions. Some have become especially known for particular programs or for providing distance education or some other specialty. So while higher education institutions are generally likely to survive well beyond the pandemic, not everything about them will. In this day and age, it's very important for higher education leaders to develop strategies for serving their students and communities, obtaining new sources of revenue, and fulfilling their educational mission while adapting to a constantly evolving atmosphere. It will be important for leaders to study higher education institutions as organizations, to learn about how to assess their programs, how to improve them if needed, and to understand how to interact with policymakers in order to obtain continued financial and political support for higher education. This won't be an easy task, but through a careful study of higher education, current and future leaders in the sector can transform their institutions to meet the needs of the 21st century. On this and the next slide, I'll provide some suggestions for things that higher education leaders may want to consider to help their organizations adjust to their evolving context. First, institutions should reach out to new student populations other than traditional college-going age students. This includes returning adult students, students located in remote areas, and international students, among others. One of the ways institutions can do this is by leveraging educational technologies to increase college access and student success. Also, as I've argued here and elsewhere, higher education leaders of all kinds and all ranks should become more policy-minded. Learn about how policy-making processes work and which policies are beneficial for higher education. Network with people in the policy community and engage in advocacy work. That is becoming increasingly important and necessary for higher education leadership. Next, it is important for higher education leaders to learn about assessment and research methods. This can help leadership understand the extent to which their programs are helping students achieve success and what can be done to improve programs that are less effective. Having data is also important for persuasion, whether you're trying to persuade your institution's leadership to provide more resources for your program or to keep your department going during turbulent times. Being able to point to evidence of a program's success can be very helpful. Finally, higher education leaders should be innovative. As I said at the beginning of my presentation today, it's time for leaders to think outside the box. Higher education is known for being resistant to change, and often institutions don't want to be the first of their kind to do something truly different. But as I wrote in my Chronicle article and reiterated here today, change is often necessary, and change is often what institutions and programs need to do in order to survive. So thank you for your attention to my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.